Today, we're going to take a fresh look at one of history's most fascinating rulers, the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. Now, we all think we know his story, right? But the truth, which he literally carved in stone, tells a much more radical and honestly, a far more interesting tale. You know the legend. It's one of the greatest redemption stories ever told. You've got this ruthless, bloodthirsty emperor who, after one horrific battle, is so disgusted by the carnage that he completely renounces violence and becomes a saint. It's a powerful story for sure, and it's pretty much defined how we see Ashoka for centuries. But what if that dramatic turning point, that story we all know, just isn't true? What if the evidence from the emperor's own mouth, well, his own chisel, tells a completely different story, one that changes, well, pretty much everything? Okay, so before we get into the evidence that blows this all up, let's just do a quick recap of that famous legend, the story of Ashoka's supposed transformation from a cruel conqueror into a pious saint. So the legend basically presents us with two completely different Ashokas. First, you've got Ashoka, which means Ashoka the Cruel. This is the guy who's all about military force, conquering territory, just a brutal warlord. Then, boom, after the Kalinga War, he has this massive change of heart and becomes Dharmashoka, Ashoka the Pious, a ruler who's all about peace and righteousness. The war is the light switch moment. Right, but here's where that neat and tidy story completely collides with reality. Because when we actually look at Ashoka's own words, which he had carved into rocks and pillars all across his empire, that timeline it falls apart. This right here, this is the smoking gun. This is from one of his edicts, and it's Ashoka describing his own spiritual journey. And listen to what he says. He says he's been a Buddhist lay follower for over 2.5 years, but, and this is his own admission, he had not been very zealous. He was kind of phoning it in, until about a year ago. Okay, so let's just do the math here. It's pretty simple. We know the bloody Kalinga War happened in the 8th year of his reign. We know this edict was issued around his 10th year. So if you just work backwards from what he said in the edict, it means he first became a Buddhist lay follower way back in the 4th year of his reign. That is 4 full years before the Kalinga War. He was already a Buddhist when he waged that brutal war. So that raises a really big and frankly a very uncomfortable question, doesn't it? Why on earth would a Buddhist king wage one of the most savage and bloody wars in the history of ancient India? Well, the answer seems to lie in this incredible tension between his personal faith and his public duty. See, as an emperor, his number one job was something called Rajadharma, and that was the sacred duty of a king to protect and, yes, expand his empire. And warfare was just an accepted part of that job description. And this, right here, is the key to understanding the real Ashoka. The Kalinga War wasn't the cause of his conversion, it was the catalyst that supercharged it. Think about it. Before the war, he was a casual Buddhist, not very zealous, as he put it. But witnessing the absolute horror of Kalinga, the death and suffering, it must have created this profound crisis of conscience that took his quiet, passive faith and turned it into an active, world-changing mission. Okay, so Ashoka has this massive personal and spiritual transformation, but this creates a huge political problem. I mean, how do you actually govern one of the largest empires in the world when you've just sworn off conquest, the very tool you used to build it? This was the central question he had to answer. His empire was enormous, a massive patchwork of different peoples, cultures, and religions. Without the threat of an army marching in, what was going to hold it all together? He needed a whole new system, a new reason for the empire to exist. And his solution was, frankly, an act of administrative genius. He decided to re-engineer the entire machinery of the state, to turn his government into a giant engine for promoting ethical living. Now, the cool thing is, he didn't have to start from scratch. He had inherited this incredibly efficient bureaucracy, this steel frame of government from his grandfather. You had guys like the Siddhartha managing all the money, and the Rajukas handling justice out in the provinces. He kept all of that. It worked, so why change it? But then he added his own revolutionary upgrade. He created a brand new type of official called the Dhamma Mahamatras, which basically means officers of righteousness. And these guys had a totally new and really powerful job. Now, this is what's so incredibly clever. On one hand, these officers were all about social welfare. They promoted ethical behavior, they made sure everyone was treated fairly, they even looked after prisoners. But on the other hand, they were an amazing tool of political control. See, they could bypass all the local governors and they reported directly to Ashoka himself. They were basically his eyes and ears across the entire subcontinent, giving him a direct line of information and control that no emperor had ever had before. And this model is a brilliant way to understand how he managed it all. He was smart. He didn't try to rule every corner of his vast empire in the exact same way. In the heart of the empire, around his capital, control was direct and rigid. In the major provinces, he relied on his strong bureaucracy. But out on the fringes, in the tribal areas, he used a lighter touch. He relied less on force and more on the soft power of his ethical message, his Dhamma, to win people over. So when you put all these pieces together, you start to see a new picture of Ashoka. This wasn't a king who gave up power for his faith. This was a king who figured out how to redefine power itself. He literally replaced what he called Bharigosha, the sound of the war drum, with Dhammagosha, the sound of righteousness. It was this massive ideological shift, away from conquest by the sword and towards a new kind of conquest by moral persuasion. He wanted to win the hearts and minds of his people, not just their land. So if you want to boil his whole strategy down, it's basically these 3 steps. First, he kept the hardware, that efficient Mauryan bureaucracy. Second, he installed a brand new operating system, his revolutionary policy of Dhamma. And third, he used his edicts to broadcast that new OS to every single person in his empire. And you have to understand, these edicts weren't just monuments. They were a revolutionary form of ancient mass media. By having his message carved in local languages that people could actually understand, he was bypassing the priests and the governors and speaking directly to his subjects. He was building a personal connection between the ruler and the ruled. So in the end, we're left with a much more complex and I think a much more impressive figure. Maybe the real story of Ashoka isn't about a sinner becoming a saint. Maybe it's the story of a political visionary who, after a crisis of conscience, figured out how to fuse faith and statecraft, and in the process, created a new kind of empire, one held together not just by force, but by an idea.